Ecclesiastes is this very interesting book which exposes certain tensions. We're told that the life of man is not one that has a glimpse of eternity, that there are these grand recurring patterns. What we do in this life will simply be swept away by history. The sun sets and then it rises again, and sets again and it rises again. And that to believe that we are leaving something behind is vanity. To live in such a way as to stamp our name in history is an act of sort of futile vandalism and childish rebellion.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Catholic Founders Podcast. I am Silas Maynor, your host, and I'm coming to you from Nashville. So if you notice, my background is a little bit different. Kind of looks like I'm in my grandma's house. It's because we're in a temporary spot as we get settled in. Nashville. We just moved here. So if you know anybody in Nashville or if you're based in Nashville, reach out to us. We'd love to connect. We're very excited to be hosting dinners here and doing a lot of different things with Catholic Founders in the coming year. So today's conversation is extremely special to me, and we are talking about family legacy. So a while back, this topic came up on, I think it was episode 40 with Mike Parrott. And well, since then I ended up reading this book called Leaving a Legacy by Johann Kurtz. And it honestly blew my mind. I have since given about 8 copies away and have convinced another roughly dozen people or so to buy this book. And well, today we are speaking with the author of that book. So this topic is extremely relevant for us as Catholic entrepreneurs because it addresses charitable giving, rebuilding society, and raising children to keep the faith and to become stewards. And these are all things that are in line with what it means to be a Catholic founder. We've talked about things surrounding this topic quite a lot, but this one and this conversation specifically covers a lot of those things very directly. If you have not already, I do urge you to get a copy of the book and read it. I read quite a lot of books, and I have to say it's been a very long time since a book had such an impact on me as this one did. Before the show starts, a quick shout out to our sponsors, Verso Jobs. If you need to hire mission-aligned talent, reach out to them. And Paraclete VA. If you're looking to hire offshore talent, but you want to make sure that they're Catholic, reach out to Paraclete VA. You could do that in the description. And if you would like to sponsor this show, we are looking to line up sponsors for 2026. So if you'd like to get your business in front of other Catholic entrepreneurs and business folks, you can do so on this very podcast and newsletter. You can reach out to us at admin@catholicfounders.com. And finally, if you'd like to consider joining a group of like-minded individuals, of builders and Catholic business owners, consider joining the Catholic Founders Guild today. It is our peer group of Catholic entrepreneurs across the world, primarily in the US. It's $10 a month or $100 a year, so everybody can afford to be part of it. If you consider yourself somebody who is building and doing things for God's will, this is the right group for you. So without any further delay, enjoy this episode with Johann Kurtz. Johann Kurtz, welcome to the podcast. How are you doing today?
Good. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, absolutely, man. Thanks for making the time. I know you've got a lot of podcast books right now, but you made the time for this one to carve it out, so I appreciate that. I want to just give a quick bit of context. I ended up finding you because I follow a lot of different people on Substack, and I found you on Substack before you had revealed who you were. And I did see I think it went probably viral, I'm assuming, your note on Substack around the book. So I was like, immediately I picked it up. I love to support other Substack authors. I hadn't really read any of your work prior to this, so it's surprising that I was just bought the book right away. But I had it on my shelf before I was about to leave for New York, and I was like, I had so many other books I was reading, but I thought, something about this book, I'm gonna grab it. So I grabbed it on the plane. I was like, man, this is crazy. I love this book. I love the things that you're talking about. To me, like within just a couple pages, I thought to myself, man, this is the solution to America's problems, right? Like that's literally how strongly I felt about this. And I was like, I gotta get this guy on the podcast. So I definitely appreciate you coming on. Would maybe like to have you just give like a very high kind of a little summary or premise of the book for anybody who's not familiar, who hasn't heard me talk about it already.
Sure. Well, the book is called Leaving a Legacy, Inheritance, Charity, and Thousand-Year Families. And it was written to attempt to address this fundamental question that I saw recur on social media, which was, why should we not disinherit our children and give all our wealth to charity? And this was increasingly a somewhat provocative stance taken by both billionaires and household name celebrities. And I observed that people were reacting with outrage to that, but they didn't necessarily have a moral language to respond. So I wrote an initial essay which began to carve out how I thought I would respond to that. And I have to say I did that with some trepidation. I'm a Catholic myself, and it did seem to me that there are very strong commandments to ensure that charity is flowing within your family and community. But actually I uncovered that there's a very interesting history here, in particular a tension between charity and philanthropy. And really, it was the Catholic Church and communities in America who are very strongly defending this traditional conception of charity, which is one which is rooted in particular communities. It's intended to alleviate suffering. It accepts that society will never be perfected, that this is a fallen world, and it does its best to ease the suffering of people in need. And you can obviously find many sort of biblical passages and so forth that support that. And actually, this thing that people are reacting against, which is this notion of wholesale donations to large, typically secular bureaucracies operating according to principles that we would recognize as technocratic, aiming to actually fundamentally solve the imperfections of this world rather than just alleviate suffering. That is a contemporary secular project primarily, although there are Catholic charities that I think can more accurately be described as philanthropic organizations. But there's actually a lot of tension between the Catholic Church and those organizations. There's a rich history here with people like Orestes Brownson and the end of the 19th century. So there's a rich theme here. And really, I wrote this book that I thought would be a single answer to a single question that I could get out in an essay. And it turned out that there were so many interlinked questions here. What is charity? Who do we owe it to? Who is our neighbor? Does family have a special place in that hierarchy? If so, how do we stop that money from corrupting our children? How do we ensure that it actually perpetuates a virtuous legacy, that these are virtuous children that grow up with a sense of responsibility to do good in accordance with a Catholic faith? Are there any families who have done that successfully, or is this a fantasy? Is the shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations sort of immutable law? And so it became this large book. Really, each chapter tackles a different moral issue: nepotism, meritocracy, charity, spending, etc. And it attempts to cohere this into a single vision of what a wealthy, materially abundant Catholic family should do with their wealth to perpetuate a virtuous society.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, you said it's a large book. I would say it's actually a very concise book, which I appreciate because I think a lot of writers, when they write books for the sake of writing books, they write a lot of pages. Being a Substacker, I think that you understand the importance of being concise. So I definitely appreciate that about the book. It wasn't too hard for me, a very slow reader, to get through. So that's interesting. I'm curious about this idea. Have you seen that even the folks who came from nothing, who achieved great wealth, they also are of the opinion to give things away, or did those people tend to err towards the side of let's build some sort of legacy for the future?
No, I think those people actually tended to lean more on giving away their wealth. And I think part of the reason for that is that passing on wealth in a stable way that does not corrupt your children is actually a very complex endeavor, and you have to know how to do it. You have to have family practice, which is built around a recognition that this is actually a hard task and requires expertise and intentionality and so forth. And a lot of the magnates who are famous because really they gave everything away. They endowed these massive foundations that bore their names with wealth, and they sent those foundations off into the world. Those were typically, and they had their reflection in other families like the Vanderbilts, who accrued massive wealth and then lost it through profligate spending and other things in a different way. So they tried to pass on their wealth and failed because they didn't have these lived practices that the great aristocratic Catholic dynasties did.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's quite fascinating. I never thought about that interplay, but that makes a lot of sense. And I'm curious, from your perspective, I guess, who do you think? I mean, everybody could read it, right? But who do you think should read this? Like, who are the people that this is going to be most affecting to?
It was written with 2 target audiences in mind. The first is really wealthy older people coming to the end of their lives who have worked tremendously hard. They've accrued material success in one of the most prosperous times in the history of mankind. And even if they don't have a massive legacy, I think that these principles still very much apply to the middle class, I would hope. But they will have something to pass on, and they want to know how to do that in a rigorous fashion. The other group are the children of those people who want to know how to have a rigorous discussion with their parents, especially if their parents are considering some more radical action. And really just giving it all away after a lifetime is by historical standards a very radical action, although it's quite normalized now. If they want to mount a defense, if their children want to mount a defense of, no, you actually should trust me to use this wealth properly and to perpetuate a legacy with our family, to conduct these great works intergenerationally according to shared values and beliefs, I wanted to give them a framework and language to do that. So my hope is that this is a work that doesn't lean into what is a very divisive issue and generate controversy and sell copies that way. My hope is that it can actually bring generations together who at the moment aren't on the same
Yeah.
page.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I think for me, the way you described the book, obviously, but in the way I view it, like how you, after I completed it, I think you're basically portraying this way of life that you can build, right? And that's how at least I see it. Like you're describing this kind of method of existing within yourself and your family and your generations to follow, as well as the generations preceding you. And I guess I'm just curious, like, how would you, in brief, describe that way of life to somebody who's unfamiliar? Because I think, especially on the American side of things, this is not necessarily something that comes naturally to us. I think it, for you being from the UK, it might have been a little bit easier to connect to some of these ideas because, England, for example, has a history of this. I don't know about the rest of the UK, but I'm just curious how you would describe that way of life to somebody.
It is one that recognizes that wealth always comes with duty, and the physical instantiation of wealth matters in order to communicate and impose those duties upon the current stewards of them. In other words, if you look at the great English landed estates, which are a wonderful part of our cultural patrimony, they represent a way to pass on wealth to children in a way that actually makes tremendous obligations on those children. They have to maintain the estate. They have to maintain the ability to employ the various families who are dependent on the estate for their way of life. Often these are multi-generational families of their own who have a proud legacy of service. They have to support the local economies, the farmers and so forth who depend upon their participation in the economic nucleus of the estate. And often these families are responsible for, in the same way that the patriarch of a family typically is, for helping down on their luck relatives, members of the community, and so forth. So there's an entire charitable network. In other words, it is a highly illiquid form of wealth that is difficult to misuse, although not difficult necessarily to mismanage. And it is a challenge, but that's a good thing. That communicates difficulty, which causes children to rise to the occasion. And indeed, the evidence is that many of these estates can survive ultra-long time horizons. Eaton Hall, the country house of the Dukes of Westminster, has survived in their family for many centuries. That is not the whole of it, and it can't be the whole of it, because I don't think that model would work in contemporary America, at least in the same way that it does in England. There may be variations of that property-centric route which are possible to maintain, and I would encourage everyone to try and build the beautiful house, and one that you've invested deeply in architecturally and artistically and so forth, to try and pass that on to your children. But, America is not England. America is a very large country. It is a highly mobile country. The entire sort of architecture of life, at least at the moment, this may change, sort of assumes that children will grow up in one place, they will go to college in another place, they might take a job in the city, and eventually, if there's a family business, they might move back. So I look at some other suggestions as well as to assets which communicate this sense of responsibility as well as a sense of wealth. Typically, these are family businesses. Family businesses, I think, are eminently defensible institutions. They actually perform very well, contrary to people's expectations. They typically outperform the market for a variety of reasons. Ultra-long time horizons, clear succession planning, loyalty of employees. Often employees feel better cared for than they do in large multinationals and so forth. So family businesses represent one asset class. There are others, art and so forth, relationships. There's a variety of ways to capture wealth that conveys this sense of duty and expectation as well as privilege. But that's really the central goal. What I think is to be avoided at all costs is something that has only become normalized very recently, historically speaking, which is passing on a massively liquid inheritance. In other words, pure capital, stock, shares, cash, because that is, you're passing on a massive temptation to your children, like just liquid money.
Yeah, I mean,
It becomes a
it's
problem.
also just this idea that the love of money is the true root of evil, right? It's like it's not the money itself, it's not the asset itself, right? It's the money. It's like what are you going to do with a pile of money other than spend it, right? Unless you just become a miser, and in which case then you have probably other tendencies around just being afraid, not going out, all these things, right? So I think that's a really interesting perspective. It's something I'll have to consider more, because I used to work in insurance sales for my first part of my career for about a year and a half. And we talked a lot about protecting wealth and passing it on too, but it's usually in the form of cash, or we would do life insurance policies to pay for the taxes of the estate. So that way, any major debts could be paid off so that the family didn't have to liquidate the business, for example. So these things have been there a little bit in my back of my mind because of my godfathers. That's who I worked for when I did insurance sales. So it's very interesting. So we obviously talk a lot about business. The whole point of this podcast is entrepreneurship. Like the thesis here is we believe that through entrepreneurship, we can transform society, right? If we are Catholic entrepreneurs, truly the way we treat our employees, our customers, and interact with our communities, we can really bring God back into the world, at least in America. Are you looking to hire people who actually care about your mission? You should get in touch with Verso Jobs. Verso Jobs is a platform that uses a gamified application process to find candidates who actually have the right skills and mission alignment with your team. Joe and the team at Verso Jobs first understand your needs, then they go out and they headhunt the best candidates and present you with highly aligned profiles in very short order, oftentimes turning around profiles within a few days or a week. They also won't break the bank, so whether you're hiring for your startup, school, parish, or nonprofit, Verso makes it easy to find mission-aligned talent ready to build the kingdom. Visit versojobs.com to get started. That's Verso, V-E-R-S-O jobs.com. To the heights. Could you speak a little bit more broadly to the role of business in this idea of building a legacy, just like broadly, and then we'll get into some nuances?
Sure. Well, there's a Catholic think tank, which you may well be familiar with, New Polity, has a very good series called Good Money, which I'd heartily recommend to anyone interested in the subject. Business, maybe I'll quickly read out. I haven't included these in the book because I didn't want to go too hardcore with papal encyclicals and so forth in a book that is intended for a general audience. It's not a Catholic specific.
You did
book.
a good job. You did a very good job of. And when you mentioned Ash Wednesday, I was like, I know for sure he's Catholic, but yeah, it's good stuff.
Let me just read a couple of papal quotations because I think they're quite good in implying the responsibility and role of a business in the community. Obviously, the sort of foundational text here, as many people will know, is Rerum Novarum, which sort of like lays out a defense of private property and the ownership of the fruits of one's labor. There's quite a good book which is called Aristocracy or Nobility and Traditional Analogous Elites by a Catholic figure. It's a kind of strange commentary on America's history, and it sort of reinterprets America's history through the light of Catholic social teaching on nobility. But I'd recommend it. A lot of these papal quotations were sourced from there. So this is from Pius XII's allocution to the Roman patriciate and nobility. So these are Italian nobles, essentially, in a private address. Quote, "Social inequalities, even those related to birth, are inevitable. Benign nature and God's blessing to humanity illuminate and protect all cradles, looking on them with love, but do not make them equal. To a mind instructed and educated in a Christian way, these disparities can only be considered a disposition willed by God with the same wisdom as the inequalities within the family. Hence, they are destined to bring men more closely together on the present life journey towards the kingdom of heaven, with some helping others in the way that a father helps the mother and children." So this is, I think, a sort of a defensible Catholic vision of a patriarchy as such is not one that we would now understand it as something that's strict, that finishes strictly within the boundaries of the home. And the family is a sort of floating unit, dissolute from the rest of society. In fact, society is this vertically integrated community of families, leaders, hierarchy, bound together with shared mutual obligations. And I think a family business is a wonderful way of expressing these. There's a section I quote from Pride and Prejudice at the end. I've got the book here, but I won't go leafing through it. That might be a bit obnoxious, but it's quite a wonderful exposition on Mr. Darcy when it is realized how many people are sort of in his hands, how many families are dependent on their daily bread for Mr. Darcy as a leader of his community, as a diligent steward of everything which he looks after.
It's a very interesting parallel to the way that we are reliant on God, right? Like this is something I've just become a parent, about a year or some change ago, to, I guess you could say, like the way I understood the way that God the Father interacts with us changed. Obviously, once I had children, you start to kind of have a different way of looking at things, and I'm sure it will continue to change as my family grows, and God willing, one day I become a grandfather. It's an interesting like parallel that we can do also with the communities around us, right? Where we are helping them out, just like this Mr. Darcy character. Very good book, by the way. But yeah, I never thought about it that way, but I really appreciate that. Now that you say it the second time, I obviously read it in the book, but the second time it really hits.
Yeah. I mean, this is a Obviously, Pride and Prejudice is not a Catholic book. Unfortunately, the history of my country was forced away from Catholicism, one of the great tragedies. But there are this vision of the world is, I mean, let me give you another one from Leo VIII. This one's shorter. Some there must be who devote themselves to the work of the Commonwealth, who make the laws or administer justice, or whose advice and authority govern the nation in times of peace and defend it in war. Such men clearly occupy the foremost place in the state and should be held in the highest estimation, for their work concerns most nearly and effectively the general interests of the community. And that's from Rerum Novarum. And there's this goes back to, I mean, it goes back further, but it goes back to Aquinas in his letter to the King of Cyprus, which I'd also recommend, in which he says to the King of Cyprus, essentially, you are in a very tenuous position, because if you do well in your role, there will be great rewards for you in heaven, because you have so many souls to nurture and elevate into order towards God. But if you fail in your duty, there will be tremendous punishments for you. I'm greater than the everyman. Precisely because you failed so many people and the stakes are so high.
Yeah. So this is very, very fascinating just to consider these things, but can you speak maybe more to this idea of, I think the way I'd like to have you approach it is towards the end of the book, you mentioned something, a number of very beautiful statements, and all to the end of how do we, I think you said, actualize God's will for us in the world. Can you just speak about that as people who are meant to be carrying out his will? Our goal is to align our will with him, but then bringing that into the light of entrepreneurship, which is something that, at least in the circles I grew up around, was not, entrepreneurship was generally looked upon as some sort of selfish, egotistical pursuit. But can you talk about the uniting of these things when it comes to entrepreneurship?
Sure. I mean, I'll do my best. The central biblical allusion in the final chapter, which is on leaving a legacy, is Ecclesiastes. And in Ecclesiastes, you see this. And I should qualify at this stage. I'm not a theologian, and this is not the book of a theologian. So any biblical commentary I give here, take with a grain of salt, and please consult your priest before making any important moral decisions with your family's future. And don't just listen to me on this august podcast. But Ecclesiastes is this very interesting book which exposes certain tensions. On the one hand, we're told that the life of man is not one that has a glimpse of eternity, that there are these grand recurring patterns, and what we do in this life will simply be swept away by history. The sun sets and then it rises again, and sets again and it rises again. The wind goes round and round the earth, etc. And that to believe that we are leaving something behind is vanity of vanities, and so forth. To live in such a way as to stamp our name in history is an act of sort of futile vandalism and childish rebellion. On the other hand, Ecclesiastes also has these passages which imply that there is a way that we can live forever and that we can leave our marks on this world. And that is not by stamping our name in history in this kind of rude act of hubris. It's by an act of submission, which is, of course, a very Catholic idea, that if you participate with joy in the divine commandments, you can leave a legacy which lasts forever. And this sort of becomes clear. I mean, the quintessential commandment in this regard is be fruitful and multiply. In other words, ensure that you leave something behind which flows through history that is oriented towards the glory of God, the creation of new souls to worship God in the choirs of heaven. And so that's really the frame. When it comes to entrepreneurship and money, it's an incredibly complex space. And frankly, the theology of wealth is kind of its own topic. I wouldn't say this is by any means an authoritative treatment of that subject, it's specifically on the subject of inheritance. However, the Catholic picture of wealth is a very complex one. On the one hand, everyone knows the commandment, if you want to be perfect, sell everything you have, give your wealth to the poor, and follow me, Luke 18. And then, but you have these different models of one's relationship to wealth and duties to wealth that present themselves at different times throughout the Bible. And as is so often the case, they are gently contradictory. In 2 Corinthians 8, you have an image of a community in which the wealthy take care of the needy in a sort of cyclical relationship. And as different families rise, they make sure that they're taking up their role as the providers for the needy, and as different families fall, they're not hesitant to sort of ask for charity. And the goal is equality. This is what Paul states. That's the sort of ultimate perfection that we're striving for. In Acts 4, apologies if I'm getting any of these biblical allusions wrong, but I think directionally it's fairly correct. You have a different model still, which is that the wealthy in the community sometimes or on occasion sell what they have and they place it at the feet of the apostles, who are the temporary stewards of great wealth who decide what is to be done with it. And then at other times, you have, for example, the anointing of Jesus in the home of Simon the leper, whereby a woman pours very expensive perfume on Christ's head, and the disciples rebuke her and they say, "Why have you done this thing? You could have sold this and we could have given the wealth to the poor," as in this charitable framework that seems to have been established by those previous commands. And Jesus rebukes them and says, "No, this woman has done a great thing for me by dignifying me in this way, that there are certain things which are worthy of the dispensation of luxury to dignify." And indeed, we see this again in Joseph of Arimathea with the tomb. Joseph of Arimathea is explicitly described as a wealthy man. So in other words, there is a role for the particular, if temporary, concentration of wealth against these higher ideals. And I think that's really the Catholic vision of the world. Whatever one's wealth one accrues, it is yours as the steward. I bring out this Catholic concept of dominion, as in Genesis, dominion over the birds of the air and so forth, which is, the theologian Andrew Willard-Jones says, dominion carries with it the burden of rule. In some sense, there is a place for wealthy people in society because, according to the mandate of private property and according to the demand upon us to work hard, some people simply will generate more wealth, but they should always understand that wealth as a gift that is to be properly stewarded for the creation of the good, the true, and the beautiful, and indeed to take on their role as the kind of fathers of their community, as was described in that papal quotation earlier.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think there's anything wrong with entrepreneurship. I mean, the history of the West is one of entrepreneurship. Up until very recently, the overwhelming majority of the population across the West ran essentially what could be described as small businesses. Small businesses with a different composition to what we would typically understand today, in that they were centered around the home. They were ventures in which every family member had a role to play. They were more integrated in a local society. But I don't think there's a problem with entrepreneurship as such.
Quick interruption. If you're a Catholic business owner feeling bogged down by the administrative busy work that prevents you from moving your business forward, I have a solution for you. My EA and I started Paraclete VA to bridge a specific gap, connecting Catholic entrepreneurs with high-quality Catholic virtual assistants around the world. Several members of our Catholic Founders Guild have already used this service, and by offloading that administrative and marketing tasks, they've been able to do the work that moves their businesses forward without any of the important admin tasks getting dropped. From finance to customer success to marketing to content creation to general admin, we can find you what you're looking for. The cost is simple. $500 when you hire and $500 if you're still happy 30 days later. If you're ready to stop doing repeatable tasks so you can focus on the things that actually move your business forward, email us at admin@catholicfounders.com. Tell us what you need. We'll make a handful of introductions. You interview and you hire. Most of the time, it takes about 1 to 2 weeks to make a hire. It's that easy. So, what are you waiting for? All right, back to the show. We've been thinking a lot about this idea, and this is very central to what you talk about too, is this idea of God. You don't choose who your parents are, where you're born, what time of history you're born. God chose that, right? God chose to create your soul at this particular time, with all those nuances surrounding it. And even beyond that, there's different geographies globally that have certain characteristics to them, right? In England, it's a very different kind of history. In the US, it's a very different type of history. I'd say, I think fairly, there's a lot of very entrepreneurial Catholics that are doing things in America that are actually having very great impacts on the world and bringing people to the faith, right? Hallow being a good example of that. Many other, like Father Mike Schmitz, these kind of entrepreneurial, they're not necessarily building businesses per se, but they're creating things, right? And that leans into our nature as people created in the image of likeness of God, which is the creator. We are co-creators with him, especially in the context of marriage and family, but also in doing things, right? The stewardship mandate from Genesis obviously speaks to that. And the thing I feel we've in large part fallen away from with the rise of venture capital, and I believe you worked in tech at one point too, so you obviously have some context there. The rise of the venture capital way of life, if you will, in America has become our kind of central identity, especially as we become less religious. And yet, some of the most ambitious Catholics I've met now are building companies in the venture scalable space, and I think there's a place for that. I used to be relatively down on the idea or against the idea that a real Catholic business could be a VC business, but there's some businesses that require venture scale, and I'd rather have Catholics running those than not. So I've changed my tune on that. But it's interesting, this idea of it is really focused on an outcome financially, where you sell the business, you have an exit, if you will, and then you take that money and you do some good things with it. Perhaps, turn that into a family business, a little bit more enduring, if you will, and not blown by the shifting tides of technology, right, which is constantly changing. So it's very interesting just to consider these things. If anybody listening, like, think about the clues that God has laid for you in your life. We've talked about this before, but what exactly is God calling you to? What's the nuances and the tendencies that you have, and how can you lean into those? And all this to say, obviously, our point here is that business is not something that is in opposition to following God's will in the world, right? It's more about your disposition towards the wealth that comes along with it, and the reason you pursue the money. So let's talk about that now, actually. So I think I mentioned this earlier. A lot of the people I grew up around, there's a lot of people who are like, you shouldn't worry about pursuing wealth. Like, just live a simple life, have 10 kids, and work at a factory and call it a day. And because there's actually pretty good factory jobs back in central Wisconsin. But I was always relatively dissatisfied with that perspective on life, because I also, while there's the passage around the difficulty of a rich man getting to heaven and a camel through the needle, there's also the passage of the steward, right, who just buried his talent and was cast away. It was very, very sad a day for him. So what do you say to Catholics who are against this idea of building and pursuing wealth, especially for those who do not come from any sort of wealth, like, let's say very lower side of society?
Well, I think, exactly as you say, the parable of the talents indicates that we are to use what talents we have been given to the best of their effect. I mean, people misunderstand the virtue of humility. The virtue of humility is not believing that you are more than you are, and being very conscious of where talents you do have, where they came from, their divine origin, that you are not responsible for any geniuses you might have. But what it is not is the suppression or the ignoring or the wasting of your God-given talents. If you are in a position to revitalize your community by starting a business by which you are able to employ people because you have competence for entrepreneurship that other people in your community simply don't have, you're doing a very good thing for them. And indeed, I think you're doing a much better thing for them. What that New Polity series that I mentioned earlier convinced me of is that it is actually often ethically indefensible to invest in common investment vehicles like index funds and so forth, because you end up supporting, being a part of, being financially tied to so many organizations who are doing just fundamentally things which are in complete opposition to the Catholic faith. However, the alternative to that is actually finding people in your local community and giving them the dignity of participation in the dominion mandate, as Leo VIII puts it. I think it's Leo VIII, or it might actually be Benedict XVI. I've got my encyclicals mixed up. But essentially, everyone has the right to honest and good labor. That is something that we are commanded to do. Wherever you are able to invest in a friend, a business, a member of your community in a way that allows someone to start their venture and actually take up that mantle of dignified labor because they now have the investment that's necessary to get things underway, you've done a very, very good thing. And so I think that is the alternative. It's a much more personal vision of mutual investment in communities, friends, networks, rather than this kind of extremely technocratic, like sort of abstracted, sending off of money to Roth or Vanguard, etc.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. There's an idea, and you might know this better than I do. I'm very poorly read when it comes to St. Thomas Aquinas, but I stumbled upon this recently. His I think it has to do with the nature of man and having the need to be connected to the output of the work. So, like, if you're making bread just to make money, it's very different than if you're making bread with the intention to feed your community, right? Even though you're selling the bread, either way, it's a very different outcome on the feeling of doing the work, right? Because it's connected to a different reason. So when you are just investing money for the sake of growing the money rather than the sake of helping another person provide for their family and to partake in their community, it has this thing where it kind of like, it really starts to pull apart. It pulls us away from the transcendentals, right? The things that are true, right? If the true method of going about life is to have this unity with God and to have this kind of interaction with God, and we can get separated from that by just focusing on the wrong thing, then we have a poor outcome. So, to go back to the question around pursuing wealth, I'm especially curious of your perspective on somebody, say like myself, who, grew up in a family where if I'm going to be a steward, right, you could argue, oh, well, I can only be a steward if I was given something to steward, right? So what do you say for people who may have come from financially very little, but have, for example, myself, throughout the history of meeting different people, I've believed that God gave me certain talents and I have to go pursue those and create some sort of wealth in order to build something of substance, right? Not because I actually believe it's for myself, but I just feel like God's calling me to do it. What do you comment to people like me or to people in similar situations where, again, you're not starting out in life with some major estate to steward. You're going to have the, I don't know if you want to say arrogance or the willingness to try to pursue building something.
I don't think that's arrogance. I mean, one of the things that I make sure to draw out in the book is that there are a lot of New Testament and Old Testament commandments on the subject of inheritance. You know, maybe I can read. I've got the book here. Let me just read a couple to anchor our discussion. Let's see. Anyone who does not provide for their relatives, and especially for their own household, has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. 1 Timothy 5:8. A good person leaves an inheritance for their children's children, but a sinner's wealth is stored up for the righteous. Proverbs 13:22. So there is, to add to the complexity of the sort of theological dynamics of wealth, which we were discussing earlier, there is some central commandment to pass on an inheritance. Now, of course, we have to be careful here because it is true that a lot of these passages contain a strong faith dimension. In other words,
Yes.
certainly what you are commanded to pass on is the faith. But I'm not of the opinion, and I'm also not a theologian again, so again, grain of salt, but I'm not of the opinion that these interlocking, repeated parables, statements, all of which are grounded in the physical world, have no reference to the physical world. I don't think they're the purely spiritual and entirely metaphorical. These are direct instructions for how to live, because we do have to live in some capacity. So it is true. I mean, look, I don't have a huge estate either, but the dirty secret of all great aristocratic families is that they started from humble beginnings at some point. So the best any of us can do is be good stewards of what we have, what we're able to build, and try and pass it on in a form which lends itself towards virtue.
Yeah. Let's shift a little bit. So something I've been fascinated long before I actually started my own business was this idea of family history and kind of building a strong family. Because there's I won't get into it, but I'd like to create this type of strong family that has all these traditions and things like that. You talk a lot about this in the book and creating this sort of I guess you'd say identity that's like very intentional. It's not just oh yeah, this is how we've always done things, so we continue to do it. So if somebody comes from a family that is broken or that has a hard time getting along, and there's none of this intentionality, right? Do you think that if they want to create that future for their family, is it necessary primarily to break away from their grandparents, or sorry, in their case, their parents, so that their children may not have as much interaction with their grandparents, which you mentioned as an essential point? Or do you think that you should just try to build it anyways with even the broken family still in the picture?
Great question. I'm actually going to punt. So what I'm going to say is Father Mike Schmitz has a video on how to honor the commandment to honor your parents when your parents are not acting as good Catholics. So I'd recommend starting there. I think essentially my presumption would be that the correct answer is, to whatever extent you can pull your parents into well-ordered events and well-ordered participation with your children, you should do it as part of normal, healthy family dynamics and the totality of a child's upbringing. If they are not acting in good faith in that regard, if they are just going to introduce chaos, then I don't think you're honoring them by bringing them into a situation which will be characterized by chaos. I don't think that our commandment is that. So I guess it's a question of prudence, and maybe there is some, if you can't do the conventional thing, which is, a huge family get together at Christmas or whatever, maybe you can accept that your station requires something more moderate and a building up of trust. But that's really a subtle issue. I don't want to present myself as an authority on that.
Well, this is why I love Catholicism so much, because while there are the guides of how to live life, broadly speaking, there's also God treats everybody individually as their own particular needs, right? Like if you were to follow the standard advice that's given, like a lot of the saints, like Saint Joan of Arc especially, is one I bring up a lot. People would have said, what is she doing? She's like stepping out of her state in life. She shouldn't be doing this. But yet she had a role to play, and she listened to God, right? And who are we to tell her she shouldn't listen to God? So I think as I've been thinking about this these past few days, I think my perspective on that particular question is mostly, if you can get your own family to to a state where there is a sort of stability and anchoring, and you won't be drawn back into the very difficult waters of whatever family you grew up with, then you can start to slowly bring them in and do something. But to try to build that stability in an absolutely raging ocean, it's going to be very difficult. But you do have a duty, like if you want to try to bring them in, because usually they're going to be drawn to this, right? I think that a lot of people who have brokenness, like inside of them, deep down, they all want to see that beauty, and they're drawn to it. So maybe it's your opportunity to actually build bridges. That's my point. I think we roughly land on the same perspective there. I want to try to make sure we get through a couple more things for running out of time here. Let's first focus on bringing the society back. So high level, you lay out a number of things, like especially in the English culture of these. I think it's called the marriage season is what it was called, right? And there's a number of things where they have all these social events, and when I saw these things in films and stuff growing up, I was like, what the heck? This is like so disconnected from reality. And now I read your book and I'm like, wow, it makes a lot of sense why they did these things, right? To build this sense of culture, this continuity. There's a lot of reasons for developing relationships with other families, preparing your children to meet other people so that they can get married and continue on the family, and just making sure that they're also surrounded by other people who are like-minded and who won't drag them down. So how do we, especially in America, I think you lived in America at one point, right? For a little bit. So you have some context.
I spent a lot of time there. Yeah.
Yeah. So, you understand, like, my thing when I read these books, like, how can I start doing this in America? How can I start bringing back this culture? But it's not going to be, the English version of it. How do I do that in America? And what are the smallest ways that I can begin to do that with myself and with the friends that I believe also care about creating this society that has a sense of unity, so that the current generations have a sense of responsibility to the future generations, rather than just being inwardly focused and being selfish?
Well, it's my conviction that we as parents have an obligation to intentionally construct the architecture which is necessary to support relationship formation, because I think it's pretty clearly broken down in both our countries. The reason I turn to the English aristocracy in this regard is that they too had to be intentional about it in a very explicit way. The more rooted communities who would spend most of their lives in a reasonably limited space, the working classes and so forth, or people who worked and owned family farms, although actually the medieval period was much more mobile than we realize with pilgrimages and so forth. But the aristocracy were truly dispersed throughout the country. They did not have neighbors who were like them. They did not have neighbors of the same class. In fact, they were distributed often throughout Europe. So they had to be intentional about forming the architecture that would introduce their children to children who they were well matched, who had the same set of beliefs, upbringing, who had the same set of values and the ability to perpetuate the things they held dear. And as such, they constructed, as you mentioned, series of events like the Georgian marriage season, which was characterized by a particular calendar of events: balls, social calls, visits to the opera, private boxes at the opera, parties, and so forth, pleasure gardens. The point being that precisely because everyone was expected to participate in these things, and everyone did participate in these things, there was no social shame attached to meeting members of the opposite sex. In fact, it would be odd not to. And we've kind of lost the ability of the older generations to do this in a natural way, but I'm pretty sure it can be rediscovered. There are very, light-handed ways to do this by expanding the scale and intensity of existing events. So if one of your children has a wedding, commit to financially supporting them to make that wedding a really big and special thing, where you maybe have a dinner the night before and so forth. So you're really expanding the aperture there for people to meet each other who are associated with your family. I go in the book through examples of series of other events, but really, if you can, this should start young. And I think Catholics are well placed to do this. I look at the example of the Catholic aristocracy in France, who to this day have, which are these intentional networks of families in the upper class that quietly ensure that their children are getting to know each other. They take dancing lessons together and so forth. But, as members of church communities, we should really be seeking out other parents for play dates, for socialization from a young age, just making sure basically that in an era of involution, of inwards turning, where more and more children are becoming unfortunately addicted to their screens, ours are robustly situated within local social networks, because it's never been easy. We assumed that it was easy to get children to get married because lots did in prior ages, but it's never been easy. That's why you can get dramas. That's why so many narrative stories revolve around this issue, because it is difficult. And, I think at this time of particular difficulty, it's a travesty that older generations have really stopped doing anything to make it happen because they're scared of being seen as interfering or whatever. And there are very natural ways to do it.
At this point, you've heard me mention our mission many times. We're building an army of Catholic entrepreneurs who are committed to reinserting God into the culture. Well, if this mission resonates with you, we want you to be part of the Catholic Founders Guild. You can think of this as kind of an association of Catholic business owners who share the same mission and who take this idea of bringing back God into the culture actually very seriously. We're currently around 50 members and growing quickly. And when you become a member, you can find other Catholics to do business with, to buy services from, to invest in and alongside. All this is possible with our member directory. And on top of that, we do have 2 to 3 calls each month with the community. One to discuss a particular topic, like stewardship or competition, some of the recent conversations we've had on that. One to learn from an expert and ask them questions, like our recent one on the tax changes, or our next one coming up with Ellen Twomey, who is talking to us about how to grow our sales and our business, but in a virtuous way. And the other is a more open-ended community hangout call. These will happen every single month. There's also no specific time commitment asked of you when you join the Catholic Founders Guild. If you want to be heavily involved, you're welcome to. If you just want to be a member of the Guild but don't really have time to attend the calls, all we ask is that you stay committed to the mission of building for God and be open to meeting other members of the Guild when they reach out. To join, the first step is to upgrade to a paid membership on our Substack. Think of it like Patreon if you're not familiar. Just go to CatholicFounders.com/subscribe. It's only $10 a month or $100 a year, so literally anybody can afford it. Oh, and I forgot to mention, many of the members have ended up actually finding customers within the community within just a few months of joining. So what I'm saying is you're likely going to get your $100 back, even if not directly through sales, at least in value and advice from the Guild. We will see you on the inside. Yeah, I think that's I really like that the just simply focus on what exists, what already exists, such as weddings or birthday parties, and expand them, right? That way you create more space. I've noticed this a little bit in my own family because we have I'm one of like I think 54 grandkids from my grandpa who passed away a few years ago. So, and we all mostly grew up around each other. I'm right in the middle of the 50 grandkids. So I know all of my cousins by name, but more of us have gotten older, we don't all go to everybody's wedding anymore, which is kind of sad. Like it'd be great if we did because, we're starting to get more and more dispersed and we don't see each other as often. And, I'd like to bring that back. So thankfully, there's some actions being taken on that round. It's very interesting from the Catholic perspective. Yes, that we can surround around the sacraments, marriage obviously being a big one. Broadly speaking, confirmation, baptism, these things can be opportunities for building that. And the underlying thread, and everybody can figure this out for themselves if they're a thinking individual, is just use your reason and think, hey, how can I be intentional about making sure the future is better, rather than having this abdication of just, hey, it is what it is, can't control it. I'm not going to try to tell my kids what to do. I'm obviously very early in this with my daughter only being a little over 1, so I'm just thinking about it now. We'll see what I can get engaged in the early days here. But I think this is really good, man. I would like to maybe ask you to comment on one more thing, and then we'll wrap it up with some rapid fire. Is there anything else that you added or that you didn't put in the book that you would have liked to add now that you look back?
Wow, good question. I think actually I was a little bit reluctant. I wouldn't have added it, and it was the right thing not to add it. But the history of charity versus philanthropy is long and interesting. And I cut it short because it's the opening chapter of the book, and it's a heavily theological chapter. I mean, it has like complex biblical translation, commentary, and so forth. And I didn't want this to be a purely Catholic theology book. So extending that chapter further, I think would have cut off interest in the book amongst other people before they'd really got started, which I think would be a shame. But I would recommend diving into the history here. What I would say is, for anyone interested in this, the Hudson Institute put out a paper called Both More and No More, The Historical Split Between Charity and Philanthropy by Benjamin Soskis, which is I think I'm not sure if he's Catholic, but he certainly points to a lot of Catholic sources. So if you want to sort of hear the Catholic defense of rejecting the modern philanthropic model, that is a very good place to go, in particular the works of Orestes Brownson.
Yeah, it's interesting how you reflect on that, because I would say that I wasn't sure where the book was going to go when you opened with that, but it was mind-blowing to me. Like, I never had really put my finger on that particular issue and that understanding of the dilemmas of that. But seeing you walk through that was really, really helpful for me, and got me very interested. But if it was longer, I may have been like, oh man, this stuff. Because it was hard for me to wrap my head around it in some ways, but it was enough that for a non-theologian like myself, I could get through it. So I actually appreciate that. And I also want to ask, at the end of the book, you mentioned that you help people who are interested in these ideas now to create these ideas of lasting a legacy in various ways. So who should reach out to you, and where can they do so?
Yeah, great question. So at the end of the book, I mentioned two possible lines of effort. One is just a sort of generic notification that I do enjoy speaking and consulting engagements. So please reach out to me, Johann at johannkurtz.com, if that might be of interest to your business or to an event. I also am in the process, and there's been a lot of interest in this, for which I'm grateful, in joining together a private network of families who want to live the principles in these books. Now, the intention there is for families of some means. I'm not looking for ultra high net worth individuals, but really families with family businesses or with property investments, precisely because they tend to be geographically distributed and not in contact with families like them. There are very good sort of Catholic networks which are more generic, and indeed that's really what a church community is. And of course, I'm a member of a church community, but my aspiration is to tie Christians who want to live the principles which I defend in the book together, precisely because I do think it's important to raise their children in community with each other. One of the things that I'm trying to avoid is a very destructive practice of wealth, whereby parents will simultaneously raise their children with wealth and implicitly be ashamed of it. So they'll send their kids to the local public school, which creates a very alienating and discordant effect, whereby children are simultaneously very conscious that they're in a completely different place in life than all their contemporaries and friends. They're not sure if their friends are friends with them just to be closer to wealth or because they actually like them. I've seen this happen in my own life. It's very alienating for children to grow up with no contact with peers who are in the same situation as them. And my hope is that we can actually go one step further and try and connect families who are really placing this emphasis on virtue, on dynasty together. So at the moment, the actual digital infrastructure for that is still being set up. It has to proceed very carefully because trust and discretion is a must wherever family is involved. I do come from a tech background, so that should be fine.
Yeah. So last thing then, I guess I was going to ask you this, but I'll have to ask you now is, do you believe this can be done digitally, or does obviously there has to be in-person connection as part of this, but can you do this in a distributed way where it's like, hey, we don't all have to be in the same state. We can do this across the world and have these meetings and things of that nature. Do you believe that it can be done that way?
I think ultimately everything has to culminate in physical events and meetings. So this would be arranged according to a chapter model, whereby you particularly connect people who are close to each other. But there's lots of stuff that I think can be done digitally. For example, a lot of people with the money to do so, I've observed, are reluctant to invest in art or commission art because they're just intimidated to do so. They don't know who to reach out to, what language to use, what things are elegant versus what are sort of like very contemporary and perhaps not nice. They just need confidence in that. Bringing in, for example, art investment advisors, these kind of things to give talks and answer questions. I think that these are kind of generic activities that really, again, the whole of society can benefit from. I think it's a great shame that no one's really commissioning fine art anymore. So anything we can do to change that.
Very good, man. Well, this has been a pleasure to have you on. I'm very excited to continue to see your work. I would, again, encourage everybody who's listening, definitely get this book. For me, it's very, I'd say, very eye-opening. I haven't read a book that's really changed or got me so excited, I should say, for a very long time. And I've already purchased, I think, 6 copies so far, and at least convinced, maybe 5 or 6 people to buy it. And I've told probably another dozen about it. So very, very much excited about this book. I recommend people pick it up and follow your work on Substack. Can you plug your Substack as well?
Sure. becomingnoble.substack.com.
All right. Very good. Awesome, Johann. This has been a pleasure having you on. I'm very excited to see the work you continue to do and the impact that your work has on the world.
No, this has been wonderful, and I'm very grateful for those kind words.
All right, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in to today's episode with Johann. First off, if this does resonate with you, I highly recommend please get a copy of this book. I read it and marked it up a lot. It's really a good book. I highly recommend having this as a sort of guide that you can return to on a frequent basis. Next, please take a moment to consider, what does it mean to leave a legacy? Consider your responsibility to your children, your family, your community, and the church. What could you leave behind if you put your mind to it? And most importantly, what could God be calling you to do with the skills that you have and the state of life that you have inherited? Especially if you're somebody who tends to downplay ambition and what you're trying to build, and you don't want to, be too grandiose, consider maybe you are called to be a little bit more ambitious for God. All right, happy building, everybody, and God bless. We will see you next time on Catholic Founders.